The river's mouth has moved over time. There's been 4 basic mouths of the river. The one it's at now, you know, it builds up land and the land becomes higher, so the river just sort of rolls off that land and moves somewhere else that's lower ground, and that is a shorter route to the sea. And the mouth has been where it is now for only about 800 years, maybe not even that long, which of course even in human time it ain't that long, much less in geological time. It's not even the wink of an eye. And it has been threatening to move down, the Atchafalaya would become the mainstream of the river. So to prevent that from happening, the Corps of Engineers has built what's called the Old River Control Structure. And by law, 30% of the water and sediment goes down the Atchafalaya. No more than that. So the question was, what would happen if the river did go down the Atchafalaya? What would this area look like? The bed of the river is below sea level, well below sea level. And the river here is like 100 feet deep. And in some places it's almost 200, a little over 200 feet deep. And of course it varies depending on how high the river is, what the sediment is on the bottom, and so forth. So you would get saltwater intrusion coming all the way up the river. But you actually, one of your questions was, would the port move to Morgan City and so forth and so on? That is an important question, because after the storm, a lot of conservatives were saying, and maybe some people who weren't conservative, well, you know, in 1900, Galveston was the biggest city in Texas. It was supposed to be the next great city in America. And a storm came along, and they built a 30-mile ship channel to Houston, and Houston became Houston, and Galveston is Galveston. And why don't we just move the port of New Orleans to Baton Rouge? Well, there's a good reason. The port runs along 70, 80, 90 miles of riverfront almost continuously. And you don't move 70, 80, 90 miles to Baton Rouge. And New Orleans actually doesn't show up in statistics as important a port as it is, because there are 4 different legal port jurisdictions. But you add the shipping statistics for those 4 ports together, which is all one port in reality, and it is the busiest port in the world, the only port in the world that used to have a traffic light. Although now with technology having improved, they don't, the lights out gone. And it carries more tonnage than any port in the world. 20% of all the waterborne commerce in the United States goes through Louisiana. That includes the GIWW, it's not just the river. And there are other major ports in Louisiana to the west of New Orleans, particularly on oil. So I got you. You're next. Okay. The question is, will the river ever go down the Old River Control Structure? Well, you know, never say never. It all came this close to going down in '73, which is a very big flood, second only to 1927 as far as flow of water. Although it was infinite, it was like 1/3 less than 1927. I mean, eventually the river's going to do what it wants to do. Eventually some great 1927-like event will come along and probably take out that control structure. However, when low water comes, because of the investment, oil and gas, port, everything else, the infrastructure, you know, I'm reasonably confident when low water comes, something would be done to recapture the river down and put it down the mainstream where it was. But, you know, who knows? Okay, now, sir, yeah.
Check, check, check. So everybody can hear.
Thank you.
You've mentioned wetlands as a major source of risk, and the disappearance, and probably the crisis is to keep more from disappearing rather than in the near term rebuild it. You've mentioned or inferred structures that the Corps builds to protect us. You haven't mentioned that third leg of the flood protection defense, which is elevating houses.
Yeah.
How does that fit into your view of what we can do to confront the risks that we're facing?
I think it's very important. Well, first, a couple of things I want to bring up that you mentioned. First, risk. And in my bio, I refer to giving advice on risk communication. I actually hate that term, but that's the term of art. Risk communication is pretty simple. You tell the truth. There's no art to it. You don't need all these studies and scientific, and focus groups and, analysis. I saw it, which are all sort of implied by the phrase risk communication. You tell the truth. It's that simple. Now, I think that what you asked is an essential element, because any place you live that you have risk, sooner or later the dice is going to come down the wrong way, and there will be an event. And actually in influenza pandemic preparedness, which I'm fairly involved in, people talk about resilient communities all the time. And there is a whole body of work on resilience, and of course that's important in a community that's subject to flooding, such as New Orleans. And one of the areas that I'm disappointed in, though I'm not personally involved in it, is what seems to me a lack of any focus in this city by any leadership group, i.e. the award-winning mayor, on that kind of issue. The Dutch have a whole technology that's developing, and if you go to Holland, they talk about living with water. They've given up the idea that they're going to conquer it. They talk about living with water. And in fact, that technology is something that we could be a leader in. That we could be major players in developing all sorts of ways to do that. And rising sea level and so forth, that is going to be a growing industry. But certainly from the leadership role in the government, there's almost nothing being done in that area. And that reminds me of one thing I neglected to mention in terms of rising sea level. We are actually in better shape than many other parts of the world for sea level rise. And the reason is the marsh is alive. If you give it sediment, it will rise with sea level. If your home is built on a rock, and sea level rises, you're going underwater. And it doesn't really matter. In fact, according to a LIDAR study, so I don't know what it stands for, but it's a light imaging something. The latest technology measuring sea level. New Orleans is actually 51% of the city is actually at or above sea level. It is not a majority below sea level. Plus, another thing about sea level, if you are a port, you start out at sea level. If you develop the port, you drain land and you fall below sea level. This is not unique to New Orleans. Every port in the world is at sea level. And every port in the world that's on a river system practically, a deltaic river, alluvial river particularly, is below sea level. Tokyo is, 1/3 of Tokyo is below sea level. 2/3 of Osaka is below sea level. Shanghai is sinking so fast because of development you can practically watch it fall. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, they are below sea level. If you've ever flown into the airport with Schiphol outside Amsterdam, you have landed lower than any point of New Orleans. It's more than 10 feet below sea level. The problem isn't sea level. Death Valley is below sea level, but it's got a pretty good levee system. The problem